to the third and final lecture in a series presented by our History and Theory Department. Margaret Crawford's theme and intention in presenting a series of speakers was to provide exposure to those issues in building in one way or another outside the normal academic or high art traditions of architecture. And our speaker this evening, I should present Kurt Meyer, who will be introducing our speaker. Thank you, Mr. Meyer.
I want to introduce the most patient speaker that you have ever had down at SCI-Arc. John Sanday, I have known for a while. John, educated in England, has devoted his life to conservation and preservation of historic buildings. He is now in charge of this endeavor at the Getty Foundation and is the grants officer for historic preservation, building restoration, as opposed to the restoration of artwork. John was educated in England, and then he got a job in Nepal. He spent about 15 or 17 years in Nepal and was involved with the restoration of many buildings in Nepal, historic buildings. I've seen his work. He published some papers, and he has an unusual story to tell, because the story he's telling is how he is teaching people to fish, and he doesn't bring them fish in restoration. Sort of interesting, the juxtaposition to have John speak to you today at SCI-Arc on buildings of a historic nature that have a long tradition, that are built according to traditions, on hollow ground, follows strict rules that are beyond the people who designed or built the building. And to give this lecture at SCI-Arc in our era, where the expression of a building is so much personalized outside of these rules of centuries that are used in some of the buildings that he will describe, is a wonderful juxtaposition I look forward to hear again. I don't even know whether some of you know, but you have a Nepali student amongst your student body, Suresh back there. If you haven't met Suresh yet, he's also very good at singing Nepali folk songs. But please give a good welcome now for our patient guest, John Sanday.
Good evening, and I'm sorry that I had to break up your little discussion next door. It took me back actually to the days when I was a student, and I remember very well we used to have the same sort of haranguing going on in the RWA, which is the school I was at in Bristol, England. Anyway, a lot of water has gone under the bridge since those days, and I am going to tell you a little bit about how my whole profession has developed. I want to introduce you tonight to probably a theme that is very new to all of you, the theme of building conservation. And I'm going to do that by, in fact, reliving my experience in Nepal, which is in Asia. It's in the high Himalayas, and it's a unique little kingdom sandwiched between present-day China or Tibet and India. The reason I am here in Los Angeles is, as Kurt has already explained, I have joined the Getty Foundation, and I have been helping them develop their new architectural conservation grant, which is aimed at assisting historic building or people owning historic buildings in their repair and conservation. And when I ended up with a fairly major cultural shock in Los Angeles, faced with this fairly mammoth task of actually mapping out a program for architectural conservation, I soon realized that I was casting my mind back to the days, or the day when I first arrived in Nepal, faced with a mammoth, again a mammoth undertaking of repairing and conserving perhaps the largest complex in the Kathmandu Valley. All I had was a small donation from UNESCO of about $10,000 in my pocket, and the minimal experience and skills that I'd gained in a London office that specialized in historic buildings. And literally, from being one man and one assistant, my Nepalese counterpart, we built up a program for the repair and conservation of the Hanuman Dhoka, the royal palace in the center of Kathmandu. And I'm really going to recall that history, that story tonight. So I think without further ado, we will shoot. I don't know how many of you have actually visited Nepal, but I like to introduce it as a country that is really unique. It has the most wonderful cultural heritage, and what I'm going to do is to take you through a kaleidoscope, really, of color, experience, religion, festivals, before I start hitting home the major need for the conservation program that we developed. Perhaps I'll just return and explain these two pictures. I'm talking on my right and my left because I'm left-handed and I can never get it right otherwise. But the one on the near side, on the right, is the image of one of the kings who was actually the great sponsor of the art and architecture that we see in the Kathmandu Valley today. And as Suresh will tell you, that is the greeting, namaste, or welcome. And I think it's a very fitting introduction to this presentation. And in strong contrast, on the other side, you have an over-life-size image of one of the many Buddhas that come out perhaps once every 12 years, and they're worn by a human underneath, and they walk through the cities, and there are probably 200 or 300 of them at a time. To give you some idea of the countryside around, there's always the ever-present Himalayas, the highest range of mountains in the world, peaking at Everest, which is the highest point. And between Everest and the lowlands, there are several variations of valleys. And the picture on the near side on the right is very typical of the intense color, the vibrant color, the great combination of the high snow peaks and the beautiful flowers, the flora and fauna that you see there. And on the far side is my first memory of the Kathmandu Valley as it was in 1970. A pristine, unspoiled valley, which sadly is not the case today, as you will see. Homing in on the built environment, here you have on the near side, a very typical little farmstead with a little simple farmhouse and the farmer's land around him. Getting a little bit closer, you here have the traditional buildings, mud brick. The formerly probably had just an ordinary rice thatched roof. And then later, development takes place, and the introduction of the baked tile, the clay tile, and then the most modern intervention the terrible scourge of the tin roof. These buildings are all built of ordinary sun-dried brick, what is commonly referred to here as adobe, I suppose. And they are the standard local dwelling of the Nepalese in the fields. Coming in a little bit closer, on the near side you have a very compact little village of Sangku, which is actually the last point of the valley pilgrims as they move out towards Tibet. And on the far side, the ever-present village square with the pond, the tank in the middle. Everyday life is a great bustle of activity. As you saw earlier, the village pond is the place where everyone washes their clothes and themselves. And then in the center of the cities you have these wonderful markets where vegetables and fruits are sold. The introduction of religion and color. I mean, the valley is full of vibrant color. Festivals. This is a particular festival which actually took place a few days ago, the Shivaratri. It was Shivaratri last Sunday, in fact. And this is a time when there's a great influx from the neighboring countries, particularly India, to come and pay homage to a very important shrine in the center of the Kathmandu Valley. The imagery is very, very strong. This is just one small example of an over life-size image of Bhairab, which is painted probably every year. It's touched up and repainted on the side of a temple. The masked dances. These are papier-mâché masks, and the standard dress that is worn during the festivals. And on the far side you have a masked dancer who is playing the part of Ganesh, the elephant god. And in this particular instance, this character was totally spaced out in a trance and was being led out of the ring by a young child. And perhaps the most impressive of all the festivals was the coronation of the present king, King Virendra, who can be seen wearing his crown with the birds of paradise feathers on the far side, and the magnificent parade that heralded this great event. And this really was one of the main focal points of my period in Nepal, because we had this as a deadline. We had to get the Hanuman Dhoka Palace, which I'll be telling you about later, completed in time for this event. Another typical image of a festival, the Sadhus. These are the holy men that travel around Asia in search of holiness and food, and they have quite a reputation in this part of the world. And now moving in more seriously to some of the famous works of art. This is a stone sculpture that measures about between 12 and 15 feet long and is about 6 feet thick, and is carved out of one solid piece of stone. And like many things in Nepal, no one really knows where it came from, who carved it, or how it got there. But it forms a very important center in the northern part of the Kathmandu Valley, and is a great center for worship. And now we home in a little bit more, and on the near side we have the central temple in the town of Kathmandu itself. This is the Talaju Mandir, which is the titulary temple where the titular divinity of the royal family resides. And it's really one of the high spots in the valley itself. And then on the far side you have another of the major cities of Bhaktapur, which is one of the three main cities in the valley. You get some idea of the intensity of the traditional architecture, and particularly the religious architecture in these tall temples, all of which date from about the 15th, 16th century. We now concentrate on some of the horror slides, as I call them, because people often wonder why I went to Nepal and what the purpose of our program was there. And so I'm taking the advantage of a series of slides to show you the sort of problems we're faced with, the dereliction and the disasters amongst some of the buildings there. This is very typical, I'm sad to say, of the state of many of the buildings in the valley. It's a building that has been totally taken over by a religious tree, the Ficus religiosa, and I witnessed really the total destruction of this building. When I first arrived, it was almost a small shrub, and then slowly, as the years went by, it grew and grew. And I'll show you some slides later on of methods of how we overcame this. Because it's a religious shrine and a religious tree, no one will in fact remove the vegetation. This is a very important temple right in the heart, or actually on the edge of the Kathmandu Valley, in a little village called Panoti. And it's very typical of the style of architecture. But what's unusual about this particular temple is that it's claimed to be the oldest in the valley, dating from perhaps the 12th or 13th century. And rather like architecture in Europe, it is one of the simpler forms of construction. It has some very fine wood carvings, as you can see on the far side. But why I'm showing this slide is to show you the dent in the roof, showing you that this building is in fact threatened. And we spent a great deal of time and energy trying to persuade the powers that be in the Nepalese government that they should do something to prevent the collapse of this building. Friends of mine who spent August in Nepal this year visited this shrine, and sadly they report that it has now collapsed. The effects of man. This is a very important temple in the middle of the third city, the city of Patan. And here is another sad story, because this particular temple is one of the oldest in the city of Patan, founded in about 1540, and it was originally only a three-tiered temple. At a later date, perhaps a century later, the upper two tiers were added, and it was covered in a very fine terracotta or clay tile known as a chingati, which gave terrific texture not only to the building but to the surrounding areas. You can see several of the houses around still have these traditional tiles. Because of politics and trying to gather favor with the local people, money from the palace found its way to this particular temple, and they covered all the roofs with copper. The cost of the copper alone, for the cost of the copper alone, we could have undertaken a very major conservation of this whole building and repaired and conserved all the various wood carvings. What happened was a contractor moved in, ripped off the tiles, and just replaced them with copper without any consideration for the wood carvings beneath. We also have our earthquakes in Nepal. In fact, there was a fairly serious earthquake last year. But this is a picture of the most serious earthquake in recent times in the valley, and it caused untold damage. It took place in January of 1934, and this building, as you can see, has been razed virtually to the ground. The building on the far side is part of the Hanuman Dhoka complex, which I'll be talking to you about later. And as you can see, the upper structure of this tower has racked very badly as a result of that earthquake. The effects of modernization. On the near side, you have a typical example of someone who made a bit of money and decided that he would improve and modernize his house. And so this whole very fine terrace was completely ruined by the effects of, or the desires of, one particular person. In some ways one can understand this sort of thing happening in a developing country, but the example on the far screen can never be condoned. This was a very old Buddhist monastic complex, a beautiful courtyard, perhaps dating from the 15th century, and they decided that it needed modernizing and that they wanted to incorporate a school into the complex, and so they ruthlessly removed the back end of the courtyard and erected this very unpleasant and totally out of scale concrete box, which I think to this day is still unfinished. Another form of development. On the near side is a photograph I took when I first arrived in Kathmandu of a very fine Buddhist settlement, the settlement of Bodnar. And you can see that it was in those days ringed by a ring of fields, the local farmers' rice fields. With the recent upsurge of Buddhism, there has been a very great development, and around Bodnar now there are perhaps 8 or 10 new large monasteries that have been built without really any consideration for the environment. And the former, you can just see some of the fields still exist, but the former very defined ring around Bodnar has now been destroyed. Perhaps one of the more shocking examples of destruction of not only environment but also of the cultural heritage is the wave of theft and stealing of the images, smuggling them out of the country, and they sadly find their way to the either Western collections or Western museums. And this beautiful pediment or Torana, when I first arrived, it was intact. And there were a series of very fine, gilded copper images fixed to this Torana. And they have been stolen and have disappeared down to India, no doubt, and have found their way into museums or whatever. This image on the near side is an even worse story. It's a Buddhist image, a Bodhisattva, standing Buddha, that dates from the 6th century. It was one of the earliest of its kind in the valley. And I remember the first time I was introduced to it by a Nepalese scholar. There was a cow tied up to it. It occupied a position in a small courtyard, and it was one of the great pieces to go and visit. It was worshipped every week at least by the local residents. And one day I went along with a group of friends to show it to them, and it had disappeared, dug up, stolen. And I made a few inquiries, and I was told that, in fact, they had managed to catch the dacoits, as they are called, and the image had been hidden in one of the local buildings. And about a year later, it reappeared, and it was firmly concreted into the ground, concrete boots, I think you call it, and everyone was very happy to see it again. But that's not the end of the story, because I think it was only last year it was again stolen, and this time no one knows where it is. Another fairly disastrous form of development. On the edge of the Kathmandu Valley is a gorge which is known as the Towbar Gorge. And this bridge runs over the gorge, and it was at this point that Manjusri, who was both a Hindu and Buddhist divinity, mythology tells us, struck with his double-edged sword and opened up the valley and drained it to become one of the most fertile valleys in the kingdom of Nepal. And just beyond the valley, this is on the outside of the valley, is a very pleasant little courtyard housing Ganesh, who is one of the protective divinities of the valley. And as you see, beyond that, there are the signs of modern development. This was a bit of foreign aid. In fact, it was a contribution by the Federal Republic of Germany, and they were building a much-needed cement factory. But why was it positioned here? Because on the edge of the valley there was a deposit of limestone, an easily accessible deposit. In fact, there are deposits of limestone all over the Himalayas, but this was just because it was nice and close to Kathmandu. And this hideous monstrosity was built, and as you often fly into Kathmandu now, this is what you see. A complete spoliation of the very fragile environment. Again, a classic example of the effects of vegetation, and we'll go into this a little bit more later on, but these are some interesting befores and afters. I have very vivid memories of the first time I went to this city, of seeing this temple at sunset. And I went back a couple of years later in the monsoon, and this is what I've seen. And throughout the 10 years that I've been there, this particular temple, the roof has collapsed, it's been rebuilt, it's collapsed, and it's been rebuilt several times. And the reason why it goes through these permutations is that there's a very fierce divinity in the temple, and only the local priests are able to actually carry out any work on the temple. And therefore none of our trained people have ever had a chance to actually work on this temple. And so tradition survives as they continually repair the roofs. So having set the scene, we're now going to move into the Hanuman Dhoka itself. This is the royal palace right in the center of the Kathmandu Valley and in the center of Kathmandu itself. You can see the courtyard clearly delineated by the 4 towers. And here these are before we actually started work. This project was sponsored, as I mentioned earlier on, by UNESCO. And we raised the initial $10,000, and I was asked to come out or go out to Kathmandu and undertake the first major conservation program. And I'm now going to just run through some of the experiences that we had there. The inner courtyard, which you have here, this is what was commonly known as the Hanuman Dhoka. This inner courtyard was at one time the number one public latrine for the market. And it was a very distressing place to be in. And as you can see, it was in a very poor condition. This was one of 14 courtyards of the royal palace. And it was, when we arrived, in a fairly desperate state. The building was supposedly constructed around the 1770s, but as I'll show you later on, we were able to prove that it was built at least a century before that time. I want to just run through the four major elements and show you some befores and afters of the work that we undertook. These are the four towers on the four corners of the main courtyard. This little tower was known as the Kirtipur Tower, and it had a copper roofing, which was very unusual, in fact, particularly the shape. And it was only when I visited Bangladesh some 4 or 5 years later, or Bengal as it used to be, that I discovered the origin of this shape. Down there, the local indigenous dwellings are built of bamboo and have a thatched roof. And this was the format in which these buildings were constructed. Anyway, underneath the copper, as you can see on the far side, the timber had been very badly affected by both rot and fungi and beetle, and it was a complete and utter wreck. Sorry, we'll go back on that one. We had to completely dismantle the whole structure, and in fact I made a model as we dismantled it, because every timber in this whole roof structure was curved. There was not a single straight timber. So it was impossible to really record the building by carrying out a series of measured drawings. We were faced with the problem of actually having to make a model of 1/4 of the building, and then the other ones were all mirror images of that quarter. It took us about 6 to 8 months to dismantle and re-erect this, and you can see the process here just before we finished. And here is the building in its completed form. This was the building that was very badly damaged, as they all were really, by the 1934 earthquake. But this one was perhaps the most noticeable. The photograph on the left can show you some of the damage, particularly to the joints of the uprights. It's not an optical illusion. It was at least 17 degrees out of true, which meant that it was very structurally unstable. You can actually just see inside some props that were put up shortly after the earthquake, and the Nepalese were under the impression that these supports were sufficient to keep the building like that for at least 100 years. We proved otherwise. Sorry, we'll go back. It was a very interesting project that we undertook here, because I wanted to try and demonstrate in each of the various towers specific aspects of conservation to the Nepalese, and each process was actually a learning process, not only for myself but also for the craftsmen that I had working with me. One of the reasons one of the structural reasons, for example, why this building suffered was that from here downwards, and it was about 50 or 60 feet down to ground level, was built out of a solid structure of brick. And it was at this point that the solid structure stopped, and you had a timber frame structure which was supporting an extremely heavy clay tile and clay roof. There were no bracing. There was no bracing whatsoever at this level. And so therefore the building was really very unstable. What happened at the earthquake was that this, rather like the perforation on a postage stamp, this gave way. And the building racked over, and as you can see, the roof actually remained almost parallel to the structure below. We undertook, it's the wrong one, sorry. We undertook fairly major structural repair to this. In fact, I put in a diagonal steel structure at this level, which is totally hidden within the brickwork. And this will act as a brace and protect the building from further earthquake damage. The other tower was perhaps more structurally sound because it was basically a square with the corners lopped off at each end, which gave it a certain amount of rigidity. And other than having to clean the wood carvings and replace some of them, the major project on this one was to develop a suitable roofing technology. As I showed you in one of the earlier slides, one of the problems during the monsoon, the heavy monsoon period between July and June and September, was that the roofs used to sprout grass or rice. The seeds were brought by birds and deposited on the roof, and they took root in the base, which is just an ordinary clay, and they thrived during the monsoon. And during the harvesting period, as it were, the seeds were shed, they embedded themselves in the clay tiles, and then with the next rains, the whole process was expanded, I suppose, until the roofs reached a stage where they could no longer bear the extra weight of the growth, particularly during the wet period, and they collapsed. So we developed a belt and braces technique of protecting, first of all, the boarding, the decking under the tiles and under the clay by first of all treating the timber and then putting an impervious layer on it. The clay traditionally was dug from at least 5 feet below ground level so that there would be no vegetal matter in the clay, and then it was usually sterilized by heating it in enormous cauldrons over a fire. We were able to find a good source of clay, but we used a more modern method of sterilization by spraying into the mix a herbicide. The clay tiles the original tiles were all cleaned, and we treated them with a very dilute silicone mix and soaked the tiles in it so they absorbed a certain amount of silicone, which meant that the water could then be shed off very rapidly. And this had an added advantage in that the tile did not take on its own weight in water, as was normally the case during the monsoon. And so, in this manner, we were able to protect or prevent any further growth of the grasses on the roof. You can see here the team of roof tilers that we trained up. The tiles are actually just bedded and remain by suction in the clay that is laid sometimes as much as even 9 inches deep over the decking. And on the far side you have the finished example. As you can see, it is a very complicated roof. Just another technical aspect which is quite interesting. You can see the ridge tiles are vertical tiles that have just been placed over the weakest point because, as I explained, the tiles are just bedded in. So when they actually meet on a hip, they're very exposed. These tiles are therefore laid vertically and with their weight they keep the lower tiles in place. And they also protect a very weak point where moisture penetration is very likely. And so we didn't treat these tiles with silicone because we wanted the tiles, in fact, to absorb the moisture. And then the air would pass through the tiles because they were just dry bedded, and the water would evaporate from it. So this was quite a useful and interesting technique that had been developed in the early days. The largest of the towers, the Basantapur Tower, stood at least 110 feet above ground level. And you can get some idea of its scale by the men that were working on the top here. This, being the tallest building, was also very severely damaged by the earthquake, and we had to approach the conservation and repair from the top roof downwards. So the process was that we would build a bamboo scaffolding, which is a wonderful material to work with, because if ever a bit of bamboo got in the way, you just got a saw and cut it and removed it. The other great advantage of bamboo was that, unlike steel scaffolding, it is, as you probably know, it has sections which are ribbed, and the bamboo was tied together using coconut thongs, and you were able to get a very tight joint. And if there was any form of settlement, the scaffolding, the boarding would only drop about 6 inches, because it would slide down to the next notch of the next joint in the bamboo, which would always be a little bit wider than the one above it. So it was a very, very safe structure to work from. Its looks belie it, in fact. Anyway, we would erect a scaffold and slowly take down the roof structure, pass through it up to the next until we reach the very top. The repair would then take place of all the major structural failures that we found, particularly in this pinnacle, and then we would have to complete that roof down to the last tile and the last bit of decoration, strike the scaffolding and come down to the next level. And so we would proceed downwards rather than upwards, which is the normal case in a building, of course. The major problem that we encountered here was really one of the immense height and the total lack of any mechanical technology. Everything was done by hand, and we did in fact rig up a block and tackle, which enabled us to remove some of the heavier timbers from the top of the roof. Otherwise, the scaffolding was built to serve as a working surface for all the carpenters. And on the far side you can see the completed building, which I should have explained earlier was the backdrop for the coronation. The one thing to remember when you're undertaking a major conservation program is, however many brilliant ideas you may have and however much money you may have, the project will never get underway unless you have a team of trained craftsmen. When I arrived in Nepal, in Kathmandu, one of the first things I asked was whether there were any craftsmen available, and I was pointed to the local industrial estate and told that there was a wood carving factory up there, which even in those early days was churning out tourist knickknacks. And I said, well, if this is the case, then I might as well get back onto the next plane, because the reason I'm here, in fact, is to use the local traditional craftsmen and to help them learn and develop appropriate technology for the repair and conservation of their buildings. And in fact, I found it very depressing. And a couple of weeks went by before the key man, really, to the whole project arrived on site. And he turned out to be my leading woodcarver, Tulsi Kumar here. And as a result of him and the dedication of my counterpart, who was half my size but had twice the energy, Mr. Hari Ratna, we put together a team of well over 200 local craftsmen, and a few of them are here celebrating one of the many picnics or festivals that we had during the program. I ought to explain that I was the only foreign advisor on this project, and I remember very well the first day that I had to control. Hari Ratna, my counterpart, spoke some English. He learned a great deal of his English from me and became very fluent in the end, obviously. And likewise, I had to learn Nepali. And I very well remember the first day when Hari Ratna was sick and I had to take charge of my workforce and was communicating with them in Nepali. It always surprised me how few of the so-called expatriates working in these foreign countries didn't bother, in fact, to learn the language, because it's the only link and really one of the most important aspects of working in the Third World. I should hastily add that the Peace Corps, the American Peace Corps, go on a very intensive course of at least 3 months to learn the language before they're let loose. Anyway, the craftsmen, we soon developed, as I said, a very competent team of everything from woodcarvers to metal workers. And they were all traditional craftsmen. The craftsmen bore the name of their craft. For example, the woodcarvers or the carvers were known as silpakar, which literally translated means a carver of stone, because originally they were all from the stone carving guild. When they arrived on site, they spent the first couple of days, in fact, manufacturing their various tools. And their chisels, they would have about anything up to 25 different chisels made from everything from the prize steel of Land Rover springs through to bicycle spokes. And these were all honed and sharpened by their own blacksmith. Sorry, out of sequence. I could spend hours just talking about the woodcarvers alone, but I thought I'd just introduce you to one of the most important religious happenings that we had at the project. On the far screen you have an array of carvings of the what are known as tunasi, or wood struts, that support the roofs. And these are a series of divinities, the various incarnations, in this case of Shiva. And they were very beautifully carved by my team of woodcarvers. I had over 20 of them in this particular group. And the great day came of introducing these carvings to the building, as it were. The carvings themselves were detailed right the way down to the last fingernail. The only part that was not complete were the eyes. And this particular ceremony was known as the eye-opening ceremony, because by opening the eyes of the divinity, it put life into that god. And on the near side you have a picture of the pujari, or priest, who was officiating at the ceremony. And part of the ceremony was, in fact, to bless the various tools of the carvers. One person of that group was given the I was handed down the honor of actually undertaking this very important ceremony. And here you can see the eye being fashioned and opened, as it were. And after that, the divinity was garlanded, which is a very common occurrence of all divinities, and even one gives garlands to one another. The rice bowl was filled with rice, and a liberal dose of the local hooch or rakshi was given to the god, and it then became live and capable of undertaking its duty of supporting the roof of the building. It was a very touching and very moving ceremony. Another aspect of perhaps one of the peaks of the carver's achievements was to completely carve one of these very complicated windows. And I'm just going to give you a few slides showing how this was undertaken. We were modeling the new window on this window, and in fact this is the new window, which I'll show you in more detail later on. The first exercise was in fact to block out as a carpentry exercise the various elements of the window. And there were over 35 major pieces of timber, and they're all interlocking using mortise and tenon joints mostly, or scarf joints, and they were held together by the way they were fitted together. There is no gluing or any metal fixing. And you can see the build-up from the sill here to the various jambs and lintels as they all are fitted together. It was a carpentry exercise, and it was carried out with great skill to ensure that the tightest possible joint was achieved. After that, the window was taken apart, as you can see here on the left-hand side, and handed out to the various members of the carving team who carved it, copying the original window, and this is that new window now in place. I think it's a great tribute to the woodcarvers. When I first met Tulsi Kumar, the head carver, I tried to find out the extent of carving that he had done in, say, the previous year. And it transpired that the whole wood carving tradition was very much on the decline. It was slowly dying. He admitted probably to doing only 2 weeks' work in that whole year when he was practicing his art. With the development of the Hanuman Dhoka project, we were able to, without realizing really, guarantee these people a lifetime's work. And slowly they regained their skills and their confidence. And I remember thinking, when I saw a group of the younger carvers coming in carrying a bunch of leaves and flowers that they'd picked up on their way to work that morning, which they were going to use as their models for some of the more decorative carving, that we had really achieved the rebirth of a carving tradition. Because however the academics can read into the artistic motivation, the real motivation for these guys was the nature that was around them. One of the things we found that they were pretty hopeless at was carving the human figure, particularly a figure based on the human figure, because most of them were actually divinities. And we had a great deal of fun trying to get them to understand the movement of the human form. And we had a lot of very attractive young girls who were all part and parcel of the team. And I got the elder carvers to actually make a model of how they think a carving should be done. And it was totally stiff and rigid. And then I got one of the girls to take up the pose of one of the other images of one of the older carvings. And there was a great deal of laughter and amusement. But we were slowly able to give them that inspiration of the art form. And I'm happy to say that the wood carving industry, the tradition, let's say, the guild, is now thriving, and people from the original 20 or 30 carvers that I trained up have now fanned out throughout the valley and are working on a great assortment of different jobs. Another interesting renaissance was the art of making the traditional brick. The brick on the near side actually, as you will see, has some really rather special qualities. First of all, it is glazed. It has what's known as a slip glazing, hence the reflection. Secondly, you can see the very sharp arises or edges to the brick. And thirdly, you'll notice that there is almost no joint, no mortar, no matrix between. And the reason for this is that the brick, which you can't see here, is wedge-shaped. The outer face of the brick is deeper than the inner face. And in fact, it slopes back, which means that the mortar, or in this case the mud mortar, can be placed at the back of the brick, and the front, where my fingers are, can be butt jointed. This brick was used purely as a facade. The walls were extremely thick. In some cases we had walls of up to 8 feet thick, and they were enclosing a timber framed structure which would actually carry the main load, and this is why in fact they survived so well in general during the earthquake. When I arrived, there was no vestige of this traditional doapa or telya int, as it's known as in Nepali, being manufactured. We had to replace several areas of this brick in the historic structure because it had either fallen down during the earthquake or had been replaced with a modern brick. And I realized I had two alternatives. One was that we could put an advert in the local paper for old bricks, and we'd find that half the buildings in Kathmandu would fall down, or we would have to go and find out how this brick was made. We took an initial clue from the fact that it was called telya int, which literally translated means oiled brick. And my counterpart and I went down to a brickyard and tried a series of experiments, not really having the slightest idea of how these bricks were originally made. And I suppose the image of a tall foreigner getting covered in oil and mud naturally gathered a very large crowd, and I was hoping that someone would rescue me, and sure enough, my hopes were rewarded by someone from the back of the crowd saying, "Hey, you're not doing it right." And that was a great relief to me, because I immediately called him forward and said, "Well, please, can you show us how?" And a very old man came forward and said that he had remembered seeing his grandparents making these bricks. He was a brick maker by trade, and so he went off and collected his tools and slowly demonstrated the technique. And shortly after he'd started, there was another voice from the back of the crowd saying that he wasn't doing it right either. We were able to, I brought them both forward, and I pacified them and said, "Look, what we're really trying to do is to find out how this technique was how the bricks were made." And we combined their efforts and made up, I think, about 20 bricks and put them in the kiln to fire them. I'll just show you the technieke, because it was a very complicated, and I was very surprised that we actually managed to rekindle the old tradition. The brick was made in the normal way of being put into a timber template and tamped down, and then it was left to dry, as you can see over here, until it was handleable. And then on the far side, you can see the brick being shaped to create, first of all, the very sharp arises, and also to create the wedge shape. You can see part of the wedge shape on the edges, on the ends of the brick, taking shape here. After that, the brick was treated with a slip clay glazing. And this particular clay came from a very special seam of clay in the Kathmandu Valley, which was very much prized. And I was told that it took at least 10 years to mature. So one would go to the area and buy a large ball of this clay and then mix it up into a porridge, which was then applied to the face of the brick, and several coats were given, and it was allowed to dry. I can just point out here that you can begin now to see the actual wedge shape of the brick. After this, the brick was then burnished here to give it a hard, shining surface. And the burnishing was carried out with a hematite or ironstone. Nepal has a very small deposit of stone, other than high up in the mountains, and certainly no ironstone. And so it was likely that the stone was imported from India. But the local people believed that the stone actually came from the heavens and was either a meteorite or was dropped by the gods. And so it was quite a prized possession. Anyway, each brick was burnished before it was then put in the kiln. And finally, it was burnt. These are the modern kilns that are used now. And to end my story, we put our 20 bricks in a kiln of approximately this size, which probably held more like 2 million bricks. And we were told to come back 2 weeks later, once the whole burning process had taken place. And as was expected, we were unable to find our bricks, so we had to go through the whole process all over again. We made a few more and definitely marked the spot where we put them in. Originally, the bricks would have been burnt in what is known as a stack kiln or clamp kiln, which was a one-off burn. The bricks, or the sun-dried bricks, would be laid in a room-shaped kiln, and they would be interspersed with combustible material. They would fire it and stand back and wait for a week for the whole thing to burn through, and then they would dismantle the kiln and take the bricks out. This gave obviously a very uneven burn, because the bricks at the base would be overcooked, the ones in the center would be okay, and the top bricks wouldn't be sufficiently burned. So we adopted the European or English system that was imported to India during the Raj, which is the rotational kiln, and you may be interested just to learn how this system works. The center is solid. The bricks are stacked around this central core and fired in the normal way, and then once the fire has got up to a suitable temperature, it can be controlled and moved by moving the chimneys around. So these chimneys would be moved to the next section. The fires would then be primed, and by the draw of the chimney itself, the fire would then move on. So the bricks, once the system had been going, the bricks would be slowly heated up, because the fire would slowly advance towards the newly placed bricks. They would go through a period of intense burning, probably 2 days, and then they would slowly cool off as the fire would be taken round to the other side. And in this way, the gentle warming and the slow cooling off, the bricks would stay solid. Some of the bricks we took out just as an experiment after they'd been fired, just a day after they'd been fired, we'd take them out and they would shatter. It was an interesting experience. Anyway, the end result were these bricks on the far side, which we had analyzed in a laboratory in London and compared them to the 16th century bricks, and we were given very favorable results. There were very minor differences from the original and the new ones. So I'm happy to say that a particular brick factory took on the responsibility of making the traditional bricks, and it's a fairly thriving little business, using, again, the traditional technology, which has now survived. Another interesting process that we used for making the bells that edged the eaves of the temples was the cire perdu, or wax loss process. Now, we don't lay any claim to giving this particular trade a renaissance, but it was a particularly interesting process that I thought you'd like to see. The bells on this side are, in fact, wax models, and they're turned up on a hand-driven lathe, and after they had the shapes had dried, they're given a coating of a very fine clay mixed with cow dung, which serves to bring out all the various details. You can see some of the score marks here. The next step is on the near side, the same bell. The wax image is then covered with a much thicker clay that incorporates rice husk, which actually acts as a binder. And this is then allowed to dry for a period of up to 3 weeks, depending on the experience of the knowledge of the bell maker, who will then deem it to be ready for the next stage. And the next stage is on the near side. Actually, I'll go back. The bell image, the original top is broken off. The mold is heated so that the wax runs out, and it's then replaced with the bell mix, which is an alloy of 3 separate metals, which is poured into the cast, and then the cast is broken open and the bell emerges. So every single bell, in fact, is a work of art. We made, on the far side, we made in the first stage, over 1,600 of these bells. And the clappers are attached to a little copper leaf, and when the wind blows, the bells ring, and this announces the prayers to the divinity. When we arrived at the Hanuman Dhoka, we discovered that all the surfaces, all the brickwork, all the timber had been painted, and this was a method of titivating a building for a major event such as a coronation or a wedding, and the idea being that it would hide all the defects in the building. And on the far side you have an example of this. Now, tradition also has it that the divinities would adopt a particular color and be painted that, so that the people in the villages who may not be so theologically minded could easily recognize a god by its color. Well, we put the divinities to the test in the Hanuman Dhoka project, and we discovered that they were painted at random. And so I surmised and was able to prove eventually that the buildings had actually been in their natural state originally. We then had the mammoth task of having to clean not only all the brickwork but all the carving. And as you may remember, we were able to dismantle a lot of the roof structure, and this would be taken away to the wood carving for repair and to the cleaning section for careful cleaning and treatment. We trained up a group of at least 20 young girls, all who came from the same village, to undertake this very delicate cleaning process. And it became a very great success. And I'd just like to show you some of the examples of work that was done. The image here on the near side is the painted image, and by rights, I mean, it can be claimed to be quite a beautiful piece, but it's only when you start looking at it more closely on the far side, that the same image, once it's being cleaned, that you begin to get some idea of the detail of the carving underneath. You've only got to take a close look at the crowns or the malas, the necklaces, or the dress, and you realize that these are real masterworks. Even the positioning of the heads, there were probably 40 or 50 of struts of this caliber on the lower reaches of the main temple. And every single one of them, the positioning of the heads of the god and his consort or wife was slightly different. And this led me to believe, because one could immediately associate this style and type of carving with a very much earlier building than the history books related. And so we carried out some very detailed research on the carving. These are some of the images that I thought might amuse you at the base of the struts. For those that can't make it out, it is a collection of bodies formulating an elephant. And these were originally thought to be from the Kama Sutra, but the inscription that we discovered once we had removed the paint threw a great deal of light onto the full history of the building. For those of you that can read the old Nawari script, this actually is a description of what's going on above. But those that are, as I found in the university, the Tribhuvan University in Kathmandu, who were able to decipher the various scripts, we found that this was an old Nawari script of which there had been at least 14 different styles. And I sent copies of photographs of these images up, without telling them where they had come from, to some epigraphists in the university, and asked them, first of all, to give us some clue as to the script, and if possible, to date it. And we were told with great authority by two people at least that this script could be easily dated to pre-1630, and that it was that the statues, the images themselves, were from a very important sequence of carvings, and these actually are the only example in the Kathmandu Valley. It also shows part of the process of cleaning. On the near side is what results after what we call the dry cleaning process, which was really a great labor of love. The cleaners would be given a very blunt metal instrument, a spatula, and would remove as much of the flaking paint as they possibly could. And it was only after that that we would wash it down with a mixture of ammonia and water, which would remove the more stubborn pieces of paint and dirt. The timber is Sharea robusta, or locally known as agrat, It's a very hard timber and very similar in many respects to teak, although it doesn't come from the same family. Because of its hardness, it was very difficult, in fact, to damage it as long as they used their weapons delicately. And after the cleaning, this would be the result. However, there were certain images that were made of a much softer timber, and we developed this rather intriguing technique of applying a poultice to the image. This is just a simple clay poultice mixed with ammonia, and it would be applied over the whole image and left for perhaps 2 or 3 hours, and it would soften up the paint and dirt, and when the clay was removed, it would take a lot of the impurities with it. And then afterwards, it would be a very simple process of just washing it down. And as you'll see later, this system was used on other temples to very great success. Here is another example of a before and after. This is a very beautiful window known as the sunburst window, and we have in the center here Surya, the sun god. There were over 30 or 40 different designs of window in the Hanuman Dhoka building alone. Once we had established all the various techniques at the Hanuman Dhoka itself, we were then sent out to, I undertook several other projects, and I just thought we'd quickly whiz through some, again, befores and afters to give you some idea of the scope of work that we were undertaking. This building was very close to the main palace, and as the coronation fever was building up, I got wind of the fact that this building, because it had a very severe bow in it, was threatened to being pulled down and rebuilt, which would have been a total disaster. And so I intercepted this suggestion and said that we could in fact conserve the building as it stood. I went away just for a few days, and when I came back I discovered that against my better wishes and judgment, the contractor had already started pulling the building down, and in fact he'd removed a large window similar to this. But we were able to stop the destruction. Typical example of real untrained Nepali workmanship, which I'm sure Suresh will enjoy, was that this window, which was right on the end here, was being supported on some simple Hessian ropes and had been tied to the upper part of a tree, these trees in fact in the background, and this was considered to be holding that window in place. It was quite a terrifying sight when the wind got going and the whole window started moving. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, what we were able to do was to actually incorporate a complete concrete frame within the existing structure. And we didn't, in fact, have to take down any more than you see in the slide here. If I go back, what we in fact did was to burrow down vertically at intervals that related to the columns, and insert a concrete web, really, which was supported within the thickness of the floor with a reinforced concrete beam. And this was resting, actually leaning is probably the better description, against a brand new back wall which we built, which anyway was a total wreck. And so the whole of the front facade, including the lovely bow to this wall, which was obviously caused by the earthquake, a sign of age and grace in the building itself, has been maintained, and it is all supported off a newly constructed back wall. And this actually was a very successful demonstration of conservation in its truest sense. Oh, I ought to just... this is a particularly exciting festival. It's known as a rat, and this tower is supported off 6-foot diameter wooden wheels, 4 of them, and it's dragged by the children through the streets of Kathmandu in about a month's time. It's called the Machendra Festival. And inside there's the image of one of the protective divinities of the Kathmandu Valley, the Machendra. Moving on to another very interesting project. This was funded by an American foundation called the World Monuments Fund. And to me, it actually demonstrated the success of the whole of the Hanuman Dhoka project. It was in the days when my future was uncertain with UNESCO because they had run out of money. And so I was unable to spend or didn't intend to spend the sort of time that I had at the Hanuman Dhoka. And so I appointed foreman tradespeople to the job. I mean, we had a woodcarver, a carpenter, and a bricklayer, all who had been trained under me in the Hanuman Dhoka. And I sent them here and I told them that it was their project and they knew what to do and they should get on with it. The irony of it was also that I managed to get a couple of untrained administrators from the Government Department of Archaeology, and I told the craftsmen that it was their job to train these people up. And it was a great success because the people, the administrators, became very dedicated conservationists as a result of being in charge of this project and actually learning, rather like I did in the early days, the whole process from the craftsmen, who after all were the people that built the building. It was actually a fairly straightforward job in that there were no major structural problems. However, we did hit upon a very difficult problem in the cleaning of the wood carving. Tradition had it that this building, this temple, was treated prior to the festival. It was actually on the other screen. Once a year, all the timbers that were accessible were treated with oil. Now, in the early days, the oil would have been a high-quality vegetable oil, which in fact would have served as a nutrient to the timber. But as times got harder and probably religion more lax, they went from one extreme to the other until in the days, the very latter days of the oiling of this building, they used to use sump oil, used sump oil, hence the very black colouring. It was probably over 1/4 of an inch thick, the oil deposit. And when we carried out rather gingerly the initial experiments of trying to remove this oil, we started using various alcohols, various paint removers, and none of it actually worked. I got so frustrated that I tried to use a blow lamp, and even that didn't shift it. And so we were stumped for a reason. And then one of the laboratory chemists that had worked with me in the Hanuman Dhoka said, well, why don't we try the old poultice system? Because it works so well in the Hanuman Dhoka. And we just beefed up the amount of ammonia that we put in the clay, which was dug from the river that literally ran at the foot of the building. And we left it on in many cases for overnight, for 12, 15 hours. And we discovered that after 3 separate applications, we were able to break down this really revolting mixture of oils, and the results were pretty stunning. It was a very soft timber, But what we were able to discover underneath this extraordinary mess was a very high quality carving, and there were little vignettes really all the way around the temple of the style and the dress of the people dating from the 12th century. So it was really a very great achievement. Time, I know, is running, and I should really zip through these last few, but this was another extraordinary experience. One of the temples that was very close by the river used to get flooded out during the heavy monsoon period, and water would run through it at a 5-foot level. It completely destroyed the foundations, and we had to dismantle it and reconstruct it. And I left instructions with the people that were supervising the job to do some tentative research into the foundation. And in their eagerness, they dug a 10-foot hole in the middle of the platform, went right the way down almost to virgin soil, and as they went down, they hit upon the religious foundation of the temple, which was a little brass pot containing Pancharatna, or the 5 precious stones. So the local priest was hot on our tails and said there was no way that we could just fill in the hole and carry on. We had to rededicate the temple. So we waited for the auspicious moment, and about 3 months later I was summoned to the site because they had at last decided on the auspicious day, and we went through this very moving ceremony where waters from the 5 oceans, which in fact were the 5 local rivers, were brought, and the stone itself was blessed, and with great pomp and circumstance the stone was replaced at the base of the temple. The Pancharatna were also placed in a new pot, and we threw in a few coins of present day just for good measure, so that we were actually planting archaeological evidence should anyone ever go through the same process as we had. And the temple was duly reconstructed, and it forms a very interesting group now around that particular shrine. Another fairly desperate example, again when we came up against the wrath of the divinities that were housed in it. This little temple also is on the edge of a river, as you can see here. But what was unknown to us at the time was that there was also a holy stream which ran underground beneath the temple. And this had slowly been washing away the foundations. And there was very major settlement to this central core, which was supported off 4 columns, 4 timber columns. The neglect and typical erosion caused by the monsoon eventually caused almost the total collapse of this building, and that's when we took over. You can see here the central core, which we calculated was distributing about 17 tons down through each of the 6-inch squared section columns. And I learned a little bit more about religious foundations, because when we, having propped this weight up, we gingerly excavated underneath one of these columns, we found just a few boulders, hardly, I mean the size of my fist, on which these columns were resting, in a very slushy clay. And how the building stood up, I still don't know. And I quizzed the local priest, and I said, you know, how on earth do you expect this building to stand? Why did they use such flimsy foundations? And he gave me the right answer. He said it had a religious foundation, very similar to the one that we had disturbed in the previous temple. The next problem was how on earth could we support these columns, and I designed a very nifty reinforced concrete foundation that would link a sort of ring beam underneath all the various columns. And I passed this over the desk of the pujari, or over his knees as the case may be, and he said, "Oh no, you can't do that." Well, I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, you see that stone there, that's the stone image of Brahmayani, and she's a very fearsome divinity, and it's on your head if you disturb her." So I took his advice and went back to the drawing board, and in the end we came up with a much simpler solution, which sadly took a little longer. But we put very large reinforced concrete plates which we floated underneath each of the columns, and they acted really rather like snowshoes, or they were simple little rafts. But the great problem always is getting a very tight fix or tight joint between the timber and the concrete, because if there's a gap, then you'll again get settlement. But after many hours of deep thought, and I must say a few nightmares, I realized that whatever we had done there was certainly going to be better than the few boulders that I'd discovered. And eventually the temple was put back. You can see the process now of starting from the top and working down. This is the little temple again. And we developed one other interesting technique here. You can see it in its completed form. One of these struts had literally been smashed in half during one of the stages of collapse. And I challenged my woodcarvers, who had again been trained by me in the original project, as to what to do. And he said, "Well, there's no way we can throw this away and start by recarving another one." And so we devised a simple steel envelope or frame which went behind the wooden strut and is barely visible, but is taking the load from the roof, transferring it down behind the back of the strut, back onto the brickwork. And it was another very successful technique that we evolved, which is now being used on several other similar examples. Another project in Patan, which is, I just thought I'd show you, there are only a few more slides, I promise, showing you one of the Durbar squares, which is the main sort of city core. And the one, Patan is often considered to be one of the finest built environments, certainly in Asia. And it has sadly been the effects of modernization are present here. But this was a photograph taken in 1916 of what it used to be like, and you can see that there has, despite the 1934 earthquake, there have been very little changes. But one word of warning, you see the building here, which is within the curtilage of the historic zone, was built by the present director of the physical planning department. It's a lesson. Anyway, we were involved in an interesting project at the bottom end of that street. It's another part of the Patan Royal Palace. And when I first arrived to make a study of the building, my instincts told me that nothing was right with the roofs or its proportions or the towers. Something had gone wrong in its history. In Nepal, it's very, very unusual for there to be a drawing of any sort of any of the buildings. It was done by tradition, handed down from father to son, from craftsman to craftsman. And so the only possible hope of evidence, because I reckon the damage had been caused during the earthquake in 1934, was to try and find some photographs either of the earthquake, which were not so common, or pre-earthquake, which were less common, and even less likely were we to find a picture of this particular building. The previous old photograph, as I showed you, was one of a collection that we made trying to identify the original history of this building. Well, the best, in fact, we were able to do was to get this earthquake photograph. But immediately you can pick up a lot of the detail that I had suspected had been there and had been ruined during the reconstruction process. We were able, by extrapolation and the use of this very well-placed iron pole, to be able to take measurements and to be able to pinpoint such dimensions as this eaves point and the relationship of the uprights in the tower to the edge of the roof. And after a fairly lengthy process of trial and error, we were able to, in fact, reconstruct the original profile of this roof and this tower. And although this slide is not very clear, and in fact is in back to front, you can see this northern wing, which is the one we first worked on, with the tower in its completed form. They're now progressing slowly around the courtyard. Another interesting point of this slide is that this building was the one that we saw in total ruin at the beginning of this talk. And although the skills and knowledge in reconstruction or rebuilding were very poor, the Nepalese did make a terrific effort to actually repair and conserve, or actually to rebuild, let's be correct, the buildings damaged by the 1934 earthquake. Okay, this is the last batch, and I won't go into very much detail because I can do a complete lecture on this, but it's again an interesting demonstration of lack of thought in the early stages of changing the environment of a historic building. This is the earliest photograph I have of the complex known as Swayambhu, and we may have to flick back to it later on, but you can see here that there has been an addition, a fairly recent addition, of a very hefty wall, which was actually the downfall of that site. It's a very beautiful site, as you can see on the far side. You have a wonderful eclectic collection of building styles. We're now looking across almost in the direction from which the other slide was taken. And you can see that here, this actually was an earlier slide, before the first slide, or the first landslip, let's put it that way. And we were asked to come in and actually make an assessment of this building and to see whether we could save it. 2 months later, I came back, having actually gone back to the UK, to discover that something very serious had happened to the building. It had collapsed. And this had been caused by heavy rainfall, and the water had caused a certain amount of erosion of the foundations and of this wall. So, in the wisdom of the Nepalese government, they created that major wall that I've just showed you, which replaced the traditional wall And really it was the start of the rot up here, because what happened was that there was a very major landslide in this portion here, which was caused by water percolation. All the water, the whole catchment area of the top of this hill was fed through a cast iron drainage pipe which disappeared down here. And it fractured, of course, and all the water then started seeping down through this basically fill, rubble, because when they had reconstructed this wall, they decided, this is a wonderful viewing point for tourists, let's extend the viewing platform. So they pulled it out to about 10 feet beyond the original point and backfilled it with all sorts of rubbish. And the foundations were just a simple 4 or 5 foot deep foundation, and no consideration at all had been given to what was going on underneath. Legend had it that bedrock, there was an outcrop of rock which came up off the bed of the valley and terminated in the solid hemispherical bowl of the stupa. We proved this to be absolutely true, because the bedrock came up at a very sheer angle, passed behind these buildings. On one side of this Sikara, or temple here, is this temple. And at this point, where the pair of red pants is, we excavated to a depth of over 25 feet, trying to find out what the hell was going on underneath, and eventually we hit the bedrock. On the other side, just here, we excavated to the depth of 3 feet and hit the same bedrock, so you could get some idea of the very sheer nature. So all this out here was just pure fill. The water percolated down until it hit the bedrock, and then filtered down between the fill and the bedrock, creating a very slippery surface. And one night, after very heavy rain in the middle of August, this whole area dropped by a meter overnight, and everyone panicked, of course, thinking that all these buildings were threatened. We were most concerned about this tower, although it was fairly unimportant in the religious hierarchy. It was an endangered structure. And that was the reason why we actually excavated down to try and find the base of its foundation. And the brickwork went right the way down until it hit bedrock. It was a great pity that the present day engineers in the building department didn't do that exercise themselves, and they just floated their foundation on this rubbish, and then went to the extent of actually putting in some flying buttresses, which may appear on one of the other slides. No, sadly not. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, what we did was we excavated and we dropped down to the level of the slide and recreated a new viewing point, and then carried out by drilling up through the base of this. We were able to drain any water that actually percolated through an impervious level out below the critical slide area. And this process is now slowly being taken around the whole of the upper level of Swayambhu. We were racing against time. It was probably one of the most nerve-wracking 3 or 4 months that I spent in Nepal, because we were given 3 months to undertake all this work before the next monsoon. And we realized that this whole surface area just turned to porridge when it got wet, and there was a very great likelihood of further landslides. However, what we did to monitor any movement, because we realized that there were several other areas threatened throughout the hilltop, we did a topographical survey basing ourselves on an area we knew to be absolutely sound and solid. And we set up a series of about 90 points around the top of the mound, and we measured and remeasured these every month during the monsoon, and any slight movement on these points, which were all critically placed, would have shown up, and we would therefore be able to detect movement of anything up to of anything from a millimeter upwards, which was quite an interesting exercise. And a point that I find that I'm telling people to do now all over South America, where they're suffering similar problems. Anyway, a nice ending to the story was that during the famous dig, we accidentally happened upon this very fine stone image, which is, I'm told, one of the earliest, dating from the 6th century, and most complete examples in Nepal. And that was found somewhere here, face down, 8 feet below ground level. We wondered how the hell it had ever got there. News traveled very fast, and as you probably all know, Nepal is a very religious country. And when I went up to inspect this image, there were queues and queues and queues of people coming to pay homage to this newly found divinity. And it now stands in a museum at the top of the, in Swayambhu. Oh, I'm going the wrong way, sorry. Just to end with, I thought you might be interested to get at least a taste of Buddhism. On the left-hand side, you have the followers of the Dalai Lama during one of the big Tibetan festivals. And sort of at a festival that would take place in both Swayambhu and in Bodnar. This over here, I thought might amuse you. It's actually made up of lentils. It's the image of the Buddha, very painstakingly prepared using different colored lentils. And it's made as an offering. It was made as an offering to Swayambhu. And another sad story, for those of you that know a little bit about the trekking in the Himalayas, this is perhaps the most famous of all the monasteries, the Buddhist monasteries up there. And sadly, on the 20th of January of this year, it was burnt to the ground. We had carried out, fortunately, a very detailed survey of this building as part of an exercise of studying the buildings of the northern regions. And so very recently I was able to contact the Rinpoche, the incarnate Lama there, and tell him that we had a set of plans for him. And they're now going through the process of raising funds and developing a project for the reconstruction of this monastery. I have a feeling that if we hadn't have got those plans, that they would have gone ahead and done a very modern and totally out of character building. And perhaps the greatest example of architecture is this group of, this is the famous Matsaputre or Fishtail Mountain. And I think it very much symbolizes the architecture of Nepal. Thank you very much indeed. I'm not certain whether any of you have any energy for any questions, but I'd be very happy to answer them. It's sad to say, it's a rather horrifying story. Development, westernization, modernization dictated that electricity should be introduced to these remote areas. And a hydroelectrical project was established first of all in one of the local villages, and they thought this was a brilliant idea, and the monks have considerable influence. And so they introduced it into the monastery without really, I suppose, training the monks about electricity. And the outcome was that someone left either a fire on, or more likely, I think, is probably they jammed the trip switch, and there was an electrical fire was the result. And it burned down very rapidly because it's most of the construction is timber. Well, I hope if nothing else I may have inspired some of you to consider conservation as being a very worthwhile option in architecture.